This is the third video. I'm making, helping with just a very quick overview of watercolor painting for the complete beginner. Ideally for someone who's never really even started yet. So I answer some common questions and try to summarize some things that you need to know. I have a cheat sheet that's available in the very first video that I made. So you're welcome to look at that, and that's what I'll be referring to when I do this. The next thing, one thing I forgot to add to the last video about keeping whites, how to use whites with watercolor painting. And sorry about that. One other way to keep whites, instead of adding white, you can use white. There's a white gouache, which is an opaque watercolor, so it doesn't show through like other things do. You can add that on at the end. You can also use things like bleed-proof ink, which works the same way. You do it at the end if you've forgotten to leave your white space. But what many watercolorists do instead to keep white on the paper is they simply paint around the area. For example, the eye. Where you see the highlight of the eye, I didn't touch it at all. That's just pure paper showing through. And that's another way that you can use to use white in watercolor to get white effects in watercolor. Starting up now with one of the most difficult things to do is to control watercolor, and trying to control watercolor is to manage the ratio of water to paint. The more water you use, the less control you have, because as I said before, water kind of has a mind of its own. It sometimes goes where you don't want it to go. Less water equals more control. The less water there is, the more paint you have. The more water you have, the less paint that's in there. To give you an example, we'll use this one. If I load my brush, in this stroke right here, I have a lot of paint and very little water. So it's very easy for me to make fine lines and directions. I don't know if you can see that. But I can make fine lines when there's a lot of paint on and very little water. Now the opposite, when I use a lot of water, it's hard to keep it in the exact same place. And it tends to bleed together. And it pools in places you may not want it to pool. So again, the more control, especially with fine lines, if you want more control, you use more paint and less water. If you want the opposite, if you want a free-flowing loose effect, which can be very, very beautiful, and it's one of the reasons why people love watercolor, you would use more water and less paint. Ideally, for the average thing, what I've heard it described as the best consistency is the consistency of ink, kind of like this. It should easily mix on your paper without being, on your palette without being sticky at all. But at the same time, it should stay where it is and not bleed too much. Like if you use a tremendous amount of water, it tends to kind of pool all over and go all over. That's very thin. That's kind of medium grade. And then that would be very thick. That's a little bit stickier. If you see, it doesn't necessarily mix quite as easily. So those are some three consistencies. The final one is what people sometimes call dry, meaning there's literally almost no water at all. The paint at that point is almost more like the consistency of acrylic, or more like acrylic. That didn't show up very well. But you can also use paint that has almost no water on it at all.